The Chicago Digital Accessibility and Inclusive Design Meetup presents How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Voiceover with Rachel Hyman.
Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? I feel like I can't hear myself. I'm Rachel Hyman. I'm an iOS developer at Sittercity, and I'm going to be talking a little bit today about implementing accessibility on iOS. So I'm sure this is a figure that's familiar to a lot of people, but I just wanted to call it out anyway. There are 1 in 5 people in the US with a disability. So what this means is, excuse me, that's 20% of people of your user base that can be taking advantage of accessibility improvements to your app or to your product. So to me, focusing on accessibility is about empathy for these people, for people who interact with the world in a way that may be different, but no less valid than you do. We're all here because we care about our users and their user experience. We want to make great products that make a difference in people's lives, and accessibility is part and parcel of that. So a lot of times when we talk about accessibility on iOS, we're talking about something called Voiceover. Voiceover is essentially a screen reader for the iOS system. It highlights different elements on the screen with that black rectangle up there and reads out a description of the element and its features. Voiceover reaches elements on the screen through the UI accessibility protocol. So we're going to start by going through that. First up, you'll notice that this is an extension of NS objects. So you get conformance for free with all UI kit classes. The first property asks whether the element is an accessibility element. This will already be true for UI kit classes. In most cases, as with a custom control, you're going to want to set this to true. If you set it to false, the element will essentially be invisible to VoiceOver. So you want to avoid that whenever you can. Next up is accessibility label. This is a description of the element or its content. This should be a localized string. So I have this example here, example app here called refrigerator. It's a catalog of the beverages in my fridge. We're going to focus in on that yellow view in the top right that tells me how many favorites I have. So it's actually a button. If I tap on it, I can get to a view that shows me those favorites where I can edit them. So the accessibility label for that is just going to be favorites. Notice I didn't say favorites button. We'll get to that in a sec. Next up is accessibility traits. This is a bit mask, and here are some potential values for it. That's why you didn't want to put button in the accessibility label, because that can be indicated with the use of an accessibility trait. So it would be redundant to put it in the label. Note that here, UI accessibility trait button doesn't have to be synonymous with UI button. It can just be used to mean element that is tappable and causes a certain action to ensue. I use it all the time for table view cells, and I would use it for the favorites header in refrigerator. Next is accessibility value. This is used for values that change frequently. So you'd use it like for a slider or for the number of favorites in the favorites header. If you're keeping track of that value in a var, you can hang changes to the accessibility value on did set, which is really convenient. Last is accessibility hint. This is for if the combined values of the other properties don't adequately indicate what an element does. Make sure you don't put any essential information in this property, as hints can be turned off. So for our favorites header, the hint might be shows favorites, but that's kind of an artificial example. We don't really need a hint there. A better example is for the camera switcher button in the camera app. It might not be immediately obvious from the other values of the accessibility properties what this does. So the hint in this case would just be switches between cameras. So that altogether is the UI accessibility protocol. These properties are the building blocks of accessibility. I want to talk a little bit about the difference between label, value, and something you may have heard of called accessibility identifier. Accessibility label and accessibility value are members of the UI accessibility protocol. A label indicates what an element is or does, and value is essentially state, so it indicates something that's going to be changing frequently. Accessibility identifier is something different. It's used for UI automation testing. So you can put whatever you want in there. It's not a user-facing string. It doesn't have to be localized. So the converse of this is to please not put testing strings in accessibility label, because the system is going to read that out to the user. And if it reads something like button 1, that makes for a really bad user experience for people that are depending on that information. Consider flow and discoverability in your app. VoiceOver users are swiping between elements, and they might not see things on the screen in the same order that a fully sighted user would. There's something really useful for this called accessibility containers, where you essentially give the system a frame and tell it what elements are in that frame, and it'll group them all together and read out all the descriptions as one. If you're using navigation bars, try to use titles wherever you can. This is one of the first things that VoiceOver reads off when it gets to a new screen, and it'll make that transition clear to the user where it might not otherwise be obvious. This is also good for all of your users because it makes the hierarchy of the app subtly clear. You can't understand what you have to do to improve your app for accessibility until you understand where it stands. And for this, Xcode provides a really handy tool called Accessibility Inspector. So you set the target, whether it's the simulator or your phone, and there's a really handy button here called Run Audit. So if we run the audit for the refrigerator app, we get a whole host of issues. These range from contrast being insufficient, to hit areas being too small, to insufficient description labels, to dynamic type, which we'll get to in a sec, not being supported. This is a really great way to get the low-hanging fruit in your app, but I encourage you to just do it. Take your app for a spin using VoiceOver, and you'll quickly discover areas that don't make sense to the user or are hard to navigate. So for instance, say we added this category view to the bottom of the cells in the refrigerator app. Without any special treatment, VoiceOver is just going to read off those labels as soda, juice, without actually indicating which one is selected. So that's not the kind of thing that the accessibility inspector audit is going to catch, but it would be immediately obvious if you were running through the app yourself. I encourage you to set up an accessibility shortcut, which will let you toggle VoiceOver on and off with a triple click of the home button or the side button. You can do this through settings. It's much easier than trying to navigate back into settings when you have VoiceOver on. I also encourage you to use something called Screen Curtain, which blacks the screen out, but keeps the app and the system entirely operational. The magic number here is 3. When you have VoiceOver on, tap the screen 3 times with 3 fingers. So why would you want to black the screen out? Well, the reason it sort of gets at what I was talking about before, where VoiceOver users are swiping between elements. So it's going to better simulate the experience of someone that's unfamiliar with your app and navigating it with VoiceOver for the first time. So switching gears a little bit, I want to talk about something else, which is called dynamic type. So with dynamic type, this refers to text that resizes as the user bumps up or decreases text size in their settings. So normally a designer hands you some specs, you have something that says a label should be at 17 points, and it will stay that no matter what the settings are. With dynamic type, you have these various styles that indicate size relative to one another. So when the user bumps up font size in their settings, labels with these styles will grow while staying about the same relative to one another. This allows you to preserve information hierarchy in your app. Dynamic type is super important. If I had to hazard a guess, I'd say there are more people using non-standard font sizes than VoiceOver. I look over on the train and see large text on people's iPhones all the time. I found that the best way to incorporate dynamic type is to get your designers on board. Start with a low-effort screen like settings and have them provide you specs that are annotated with dynamic type styles instead of static point sizes. The human interface guidelines include this really handy chart that translates between dynamic type styles and point size for each different font setting. Give this to your designers. It'll help them figure out the appropriate styles to annotate with. And try to avoid putting explicit width and height constraints on labels to allow them to grow. This has the benefit of preparing your app well for localization. So a super long German word will be accommodated by labels that expect to grow, whether it's through font size or through actual text. So the accessibility inspector comes in handy here again. There's a tool on the right there that lets you see how your app reacts to different dynamic type settings. One thing to realize here is that it's not always going to be a bigger font size. Users may have smaller sizes set in order to fit more content on the screen. So make sure you're testing how your app reacts at those smaller sizes as well. Make sure you're checking the automatically adjust font box in IB. This has the benefit of if the user goes out to settings and changes their font size and bounces back into your app, it'll automatically adjust those labels instead of the user having to restart the app. One resource I wanted to mention here is called AppleViz. This is a website that tracks bugs in Apple products and software for blind and low vision users. So it's really cool. People are very sort of complete in the bugs that they're finding. So I would suggest checking it out to get an idea of the kind of issues that VoiceOver users are running into. And finally, that brings me to this question. Why should we care? Isn't this basically putting in a lot of effort for not a lot of payoff? To that, I have two answers. First of all, caring about accessibility makes for better apps for everyone. That was kind of a thread running through this presentation. With dynamic type and with setting titles on screens, it helps situate people in the app, not just accessibility feature users, but just your general user population as well. And secondly, and more importantly, accessibility for me is fundamentally about empathy. That figure I cited at the beginning, that 1 in 5 people in the US have a disability, that's 20% of people that improved accessibility could make a world of difference to. Accessibility is about leveling the playing field for all of your users. The point of this isn't to shame anybody for not having put accessibility in their product. Rather, it's to emphasize the importance of it and to point out how many avenues there are to begin integrating accessibility into your app. It's not an intractable problem. It's something you can begin doing today, and every little bit helps. You can't always wait to be handed requirements for accessibility. Sometimes you have to be the evangelist, and hopefully this little talk has set you on that path. You can help write the playbook for your company when it comes to accessibility. So, takeaways. First, use accessibility auditing and actual testing with VoiceOver to improve accessibility in your app for visually impaired users. Make use of accessibility shortcuts and screen curtain to simulate the actual experience of a non-sighted user. Second, get your designers on board and start integrating dynamic type. Tons of people have the font size bumped up in their settings and will appreciate your compliant app. Third and last, practice empathy for your users. Not everyone interacts with the world the same way, but everyone should be able to use your app or your product in their own way. That's just good business sense and good empathy as well. Thanks.
Thanks to our speaker, Rachel Hyman. Follow her on Twitter at SeltzerPrincess. Thanks to our venue sponsor, Nerdery. Visit them online at nerdery.com. Live captions provided by ACS, Alternative Communication Services. Visit them online at acscaptions.com. Live captions sponsored by McDonald's. We're loving it. This has been a production of the Chicago Digital Accessibility and Inclusive Design Meetup. Visit us online at meetup.com/A11YCHI. Follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/A11YCHI. Follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/A11YCHI. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to view recordings of past meetup events at youtube.com/C/. Chicago Digital Accessibility Inclusive Design. Copyright 2018. All rights reserved.